June 6, 1944, the longest day in history. Before dawn broke, the sea was alive with shadows. Thousands of ships cutting through the cold waters of the English Channel, each carrying men who knew that by nightfall, the world could be entirely different, or they might not see nightfall at all. The air thundered with aircraft, the roar of engines echoing over the dark waves. Soldiers whispered final prayers. Some wrote letters they would never send. Others sat in silence, staring toward a horizon lit by flashes of artillery, a distant promise of chaos. They called it Operation Overlord. But history would remember it as D-Day, the day when courage stormed the beaches of Normandy. A day when ordinary men became legends, when every heartbeat counted, and when the fate of the free world was carried ashore on the rising tide. Before the first wave hit the beaches, before the sand turned red and the cliffs of Normandy echoed with gunfire, there was the plan. A plan so vast, so secret, and so critical that a single mistake could have rewritten the entire course of history. In early 1943, as the Allies finally began pushing back across Europe, one question loomed over every meeting room from London to Washington: how do you take back a continent? The answer was D-Day, but turning that idea into reality demanded the most complex military operation mankind had ever attempted. The Allied High Command, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, faced an impossible puzzle. They needed to land hundreds of thousands of men across a heavily fortified coastline, in enemy-occupied France, under the eyes of an army that had spent years preparing for this exact moment. Everything, tides, weather, timing, deception, had to align perfectly. There would be no second chance. Behind closed doors, war rooms buzzed with activity. Maps of northern France were covered in pins and string. British intelligence, American engineers, meteorologists, and strategists debated endlessly. The choice of landing site alone sparked months of argument. Pas-de-Calais was the closest point, but also the most obvious. The Germans expected the invasion there. Normandy, on the other hand, was less fortified but riskier in terms of terrain and distance. Eisenhower made his decision: Normandy. Then came the deception. Under the code name Operation Bodyguard, the Allies constructed one of the most brilliant disinformation campaigns in military history. They built fake armies, complete with inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and dummy landing craft scattered across southern England. The Phantom 1st U.S. Army Group, supposedly led by General George S. Patton, was staged opposite Pas-de-Calais to convince German intelligence that the invasion would strike there. Radio chatter, double agents, even false weather reports, all were part of an elaborate performance to keep Hitler guessing. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler and his generals were drawing up their own plans. The German leader believed his Atlantic Wall, a line of bunkers, gun emplacements, and mines stretching from Norway to Spain, would be impenetrable. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was tasked with strengthening it. He toured the French coastline relentlessly, ordering more obstacles, more mines, more concrete. The war will be won or lost on the beaches, Rommel warned. But the German command was fractured by arrogance and illusion. Hitler believed the invasion would come at Calais, and he refused to move his armored divisions until he had personal confirmation, a fatal hesitation that would later decide the battle. While the Germans relied on walls and weather, the Allies relied on secrecy and unity. British factories produced specialized Hobart's funnies, strange-looking tanks designed to clear mines, lay bridges, and crush obstacles. American engineers constructed artificial harbors, called mulberries, to offload supplies once the beaches were secured. Meteorologists monitored the skies daily, searching for the narrowest gap in the North Atlantic storms that would allow the invasion fleet to cross. Every decision carried the weight of millions of lives. Eisenhower wrote 2 speeches, one announcing success, another accepting total failure and blame. Both sat in his pocket on the eve of June 6. The invasion was set for June 5, but violent weather forced a delay. Waves crashed, winds howled, and ships rocked in the storm. Then, a brief break in the clouds appeared, just long enough to take the chance. As dawn approached, the greatest armada in human history began to move. over 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and nearly 160,000 men prepared to challenge the fortress of Europe. Years of planning, deception, and sacrifice had led to this moment. The dice had been cast, and the fate of the world was now sailing toward the beaches of Normandy. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the mist over the English Channel lifted to reveal a nightmare. As the landing craft approached Omaha Beach, the men inside could see the cliffs rising like walls of death ahead of them. The sound of waves was drowned by the thunder of artillery. German guns, hidden in concrete bunkers, unleashed hell the moment the first ramps dropped. Bullets tore through the surf, ripping into men before they even reached the sand. The sea turned red. Engines burned. Bodies floated alongside shattered equipment. Entire units were wiped out within minutes. Some soldiers never even fired their rifles. They drowned under the weight of their gear, dragged down by the tide that refused mercy. For many, the plan fell apart the instant it began. The naval bombardment had failed to destroy most of the German defenses, and paratroopers meant to secure the flanks had landed miles off target. The tanks that were supposed to support the infantry sank before reaching the shore. On Omaha, the Americans were alone, exposed, disoriented, and pinned down. Communication was chaos. Radios failed, officers were killed, and orders vanished in the noise. Small groups of survivors clung to the shingle at the water's edge, using dead bodies as cover. Above them, machine guns swept the beach in relentless arcs. Every attempt to move forward seemed suicidal. Yet somehow, amid the horror, courage began to surface. Men who had lost everything, weapons, comrades, hope, began to crawl, inch by inch, toward the cliffs. Engineers cleared mines with their bare hands. Medics treated the wounded under fire. A few soldiers found gaps in the defenses and pushed through, pulling others with them. By noon, Omaha was a graveyard, but also a symbol. The cost was staggering, nearly 2,000 American casualties in a few hours. But slowly, painfully, the tide began to turn. What began as chaos and slaughter turned into a desperate foothold, one bought with blood and sheer human will. Omaha Beach would forever stand as the price of freedom. Not a victory of strategy or technology, but of courage, of men who faced the impossible and refused to stop moving forward, even when the world around them was falling apart. Before the first boat ever reached the beaches of Normandy, the invasion had already begun, in the skies above France. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, while most of Europe still slept, thousands of paratroopers jumped into darkness. Their mission was to strike deep behind enemy lines, to sow confusion, capture key bridges, and block German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. They were the first to fight on D-Day, soldiers of the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, the British 6th Airborne, and their Allied comrades. Each man carried close to 100 pounds of gear, knowing that the moment his parachute opened, he'd be a target. The night was chaos. Thick clouds, strong winds, and relentless anti-aircraft fire scattered the formations across miles of countryside. Some men landed in flooded fields and drowned before even touching solid ground. Others crashed into trees, buildings, or directly into enemy positions. But where they landed, the war began instantly. Cut off and surrounded, small groups of paratroopers fought their own private battles in the dark, taking on entire German patrols with knives, grenades, and courage. They captured crossroads, destroyed bridges, and disrupted communications. Villagers risked their lives to guide them through the hedgerows, whispering, "Les Américains et les liberateurs." In the east, British paratroopers pulled off one of the most daring operations of the day, capturing Pegasus Bridge just minutes after midnight. Holding that bridge meant stopping German armor from cutting into the landing zones. It was a victory that saved countless lives on the beaches below. For the Americans, the fight around St. Mireglais became legend. Flames from a burning house lit up the night sky, exposing descending paratroopers to enemy fire. Many were killed before they hit the ground, yet the survivors pressed on, securing one of the first liberated towns in occupied France. By dawn, the countryside was alive with gunfire and confusion. Germans thought entire armies had landed behind them. The paratroopers had done what they came for: chaos. Their mission was not to win the battle alone, but to make victory possible. They were scattered, isolated, and outnumbered, yet they held their ground until the beaches linked up with them. Their courage in the night gave the invasion its first breath of hope. They were the ghosts of D-Day, falling from the sky to light the path of liberation. When the first reports of the invasion reached German headquarters in the early morning of June 6, disbelief spread faster than the truth. To many commanders, the alarm sounded like yet another drill. For months, false warnings and feints had kept the German high command on edge, and the Allies' deception campaign, Operation Fortitude, had done its job perfectly. German intelligence was convinced that the real invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. So when paratroopers began landing and ships appeared off the coast, many officers assumed it was merely a diversion. At 4 a.m., desperate messages poured in from coastal outposts, thousands of ships sighted, landings underway. But inside the chain of command, no one could act decisively. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man responsible for defending the coast, wasn't even there. He had returned to Germany to visit his wife for her birthday. His absence left subordinates arguing over authority. To make matters worse, Hitler himself, the only man allowed to release the armored divisions, was asleep at his headquarters in Bavaria. His staff refused to wake him. Hours passed while the most powerful army in Europe waited for permission to move. By the time Hitler was finally informed, the Allies had already established beachheads. The confusion deepened as the Germans struggled to understand the scale of the assault. Reports from Normandy were chaotic. Some claimed a small raid, others a full invasion. Airborne landings behind their lines convinced many that multiple attacks were happening across France. Communication lines were broken by sabotage, and Allied aircraft dominated the skies, cutting off reinforcements and destroying convoys. When the panzer divisions were finally ordered to move, they faced more delays. Bridges had been blown, roads were jammed, and Allied air superiority turned every daylight movement into a death sentence. What should have been a swift counterattack dissolved into paralysis. By afternoon, Rommel rushed back to the front, but the damage was done. The Allies were ashore, and the window to drive them back had closed. The German war machine, once feared for its precision, now stumbled under its own bureaucracy and Hitler's obsession with control. In those crucial first hours, confusion, hesitation, and overconfidence did what Allied firepower alone could not. It broke the rhythm of the Wehrmacht. Normandy wasn't just won on the beaches, it was won in the corridors of German command, where indecision cost an empire its future. By the evening of June 6, the beaches of Normandy were no longer battlefields, they were the foundations of liberation. The cost had been staggering, thousands dead, wounded, or missing. But against all odds, the Allies had done the impossible. They had landed on continental Europe and held their ground. At dawn, chaos ruled the coast. By dusk, it had turned into coordination. Across the 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, scattered units had begun to link up, turning isolated victories into a connected front. Engineers cleared mines and obstacles, medics tended to the wounded, and supply officers worked tirelessly to bring ammunition and food ashore through wreckage and fire. Every inch gained was soaked in blood, yet the line was holding and growing stronger. At Utah Beach, the Americans pushed inland faster than expected, meeting lighter resistance and securing key causeways from the flooded fields. At Omaha, the most brutal landing site, small groups of survivors had clawed their way up the cliffs and silenced German bunkers one by one. By nightfall, the beach that had seemed lost in the morning now bristled with Allied flags and fortifications. Further east, British and Canadian forces advanced from Gold, Juno, and Sword, capturing villages, crossroads, and strong points. Tanks rolled off landing craft under heavy fire, their treads grinding over the wreckage of the morning. Airborne troops, who had fought all day behind enemy lines, finally linked up with advancing infantry. The once fractured invasion force was now a unified army, battered but unbroken. Behind them, the English Channel remained a lifeline. Endless columns of landing craft continued to pour men, vehicles, and supplies onto the sand. The scale was unimaginable. By midnight, more than 150,000 troops had landed, along with thousands of tons of equipment. The greatest amphibious invasion in history had taken root. For the Germans, the realization came too late. Their counterattacks were scattered and disorganized. Without air support and with reinforcements trapped behind bombed bridges, their response faltered. The Atlantic Wall that Hitler had promised would never be breached was crumbling under sheer human determination. As darkness fell over Normandy, exhausted soldiers dug in, expecting another counterattack that never came. Fires burned along the shore, the sky still heavy with smoke and the smell of cordite. But beneath the chaos, a quiet truth settled in: the Allies were back in Europe. From those blood-soaked sands, a new front had been born, one that would march across France, crush the Nazi Empire, and restore freedom to a continent that had waited too long. D-Day was not the end of the war, but it was the beginning of its end. When the guns finally fell silent over Normandy, the beaches were no longer just stretches of sand, they were sacred ground. Beneath the waves and in the dunes lay the price of freedom, paid in full by men who would never return home. The sea that had carried them to war now carried their names, whispered forever by the tide. June 6, 1944, D-Day, was more than a victory. It was a turning point in human history. The courage of those who stormed the beaches, jumped from the skies, and fought through the hedgerows carved the path that would lead to the downfall of tyranny. They faced not just bullets and bombs, but the very weight of destiny. Many were no older than 20, yet in a single day they changed the course of the 20th century. On that day, ordinary men did extraordinary things. Farmers, teachers, factory workers, men who had once led simple lives, became the instruments of liberation. They charged through gunfire, waded through blooded surf, and held the line when everything around them fell apart. Their bravery wasn't loud or glamorous. It was quiet, stubborn, relentless, the kind that keeps moving forward even when the world seems to end. For every soldier who lived to see the sunset, another fell before noon. Some never made it off the boats. Others died with the name of a loved one on their lips. And yet, even in death, they achieved something timeless. They proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. In the years that followed, the beaches of Normandy would grow peaceful again. Grass would cover the craters, the tides would wash away the stains of war, and new generations would walk those shores freely, often unaware of the sacrifice that had made it possible. But beneath the calm lies the memory of chaos, of valor, of the countless who gave everything so that others might live in peace. Today, crosses and stars of David stand row upon row across the cliffs, silent sentinels overlooking the same sea that once roared with fire. Each one marks a story unfinished, a life given for something greater than self. Together, they remind us that freedom is never free, it is earned, defended, and renewed with every generation that remembers. The legacy of D-Day is not just a chapter in history books, it is a living testament to the strength of the human spirit. It speaks of unity in the face of fear, of sacrifice in the face of impossible odds, and of hope rising from the darkest hours. When we look back on that longest day, we are not just remembering war, we are remembering courage. We are remembering those who stood up when the world needed them most. And as long as the waves break upon the Normandy shore, their echo will remain. A whisper through time that says, they came, they fought, they gave everything, so that we could be free.